Like many Canadians, I was watching the U.S. midterm elections last night. In fact, it's kind of crazy how invested so many Canadians are in the elections south of the border. Everybody wanted to see what was going to happen to Trump supported candidates, that sort of thing. And there were all sorts of individual races that people were talking about on Twitter. Canadians were. But we need to pull back a little bit and get some perspective. So I'm going to talk to Ryan Kennedy, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Houston and founding director of the UH Center for International and Comparative Studies. So welcome to the interview, Ryan.
Thank you, Markham. It's great to be here.
Well, this should be fun, right? I mean, it was political silly season last night. So maybe just, give us the 35,000 foot view of how the midterm elections turned out last night.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's still a little bit early to see. There are some races that haven't been called. We still got some things that need to be decided. They haven't officially called that the House of Representatives is going to go Republican, but it looks like it will, although it looks like it'll be a much smaller majority for Republicans than were initially thought. The Senate is looking like it's going to be right around evenly divided. There are still like 3 races to determine it, but right now Democrats lead in 2 of those races. And I don't want to call them, but it kind of looks like they'll get, and then it looks like Georgia will be the one in the runoff that's going to decide the Senate. But Republicans are very disappointed by this, both historically and with what they were expecting going in from their own internal polling and from what they were seeing on the ground. This is not the so-called red wave that they were expecting to occur with this election. And we traditionally see with the first midterm of a new president. And so it was definitely a mixed bag of results. You were mentioning some of the Trump-backed candidates. J.D. Vance won in Ohio, but then on the other hand, Dr. Oz ended up losing in Pennsylvania. And in Georgia, it looks like Herschel Walker is heading to a runoff election in a state that was, until 2020, really considered a conservative stronghold.
Somebody asked me to explain Georgia and Herschel Walker, and I said, well, okay, think of Americans' approach to religion. Football, Christianity. Everybody knows who Herschel Walker is, right? He's a football legend. There you go. Anyway.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So, okay, what kind of implications does this have for the Biden administration's energy policy? Because we just had, a couple months ago, it was late August, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion, which is basically, as I see it, is almost a declaration of war, economic war with China. We're saying, okay, you guys have got ahead of us in clean energy, electric vehicles, batteries, that sort of stuff. We're going to catch up by 2030. And we're going to reshore, friendshore all those supply chains and create a bunch of jobs and on and on and on. So if I heard, plenty of chatter that if it was a red tide, that was going to spell trouble for the IRA. But now this more balanced, or at least, nobody has a real advantage, would seem to favor the IRA.
To an extent. So what we're probably going to see, and it really depends on what approach the Republicans take and how much McCarthy, who is the likely new Speaker of the House, what approach he decides to take, right? On the one hand, you've got recent elections where Republicans took control of a branch of Congress. They've been highly oppositional. And in particular, with their likely control of the House of Representatives, they can do some things with their power of the purse that would kind of handicap the Biden agenda. So they can, put things, they can refuse, for example, to increase the debt ceiling unless, certain funding is held up or withdrawn from particular programs. You'll probably see Democrats try during the lame duck session before the new Congress comes into effect to pass funding for some of these things, but Republicans will likely have at least the ability to hold up some of the funding parts. In particular, what I've heard mentioned is some of the international parts. So trying to help fund clean energies in developing countries, that these kind of things might be held up in the House. if Republicans get control of the Senate, that also raises their ability to block, for example, appointments to the the EPA and other executive branches to try and slow down implementation of some of Biden's agenda. So depending on what happens there, we're going to see what ends up happening. Just as important, much like in Canada, of course, the United States has a multi-tiered government system. And some of the things that have been really interesting from a clean energy perspective have been happening on the state level. So California, Michigan, Maine, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and all these states, governors won who have actually set pretty strong clean energy agendas and very much supported Biden's goals for clean energy and greenhouse gas reduction. The race in Oregon, which is probably one of the most important with regards to clean energy, is still considered too close to call. But at the time that I'm speaking, the Democratic candidate is ahead in that race. So, there's quite a bit that Republicans can do to hold up or not fund certain parts of Biden's agenda, but certainly not as much as they would have had this red wave they were expecting materialized. Plus, then there's the other thing, which is that will there be some Republicans who decide to form a moderate caucus? If that happens, if you go back to like the 1990 style Republican governorship, then there may be some room for more compromise bipartisanship.
What are the likelihood that that's going to happen, Ryan? Because from north of the border, looking down on it, it seems like a monolith, right? The Republicans have how would we say this politely, migrated to the right. And it seems like it seems like there aren't any moderate Republicans anymore, but that's probably a misreading on my part. Would there be enough to form an influential moderate caucus?
Well, that is the real question, especially in the House. Republicans have been very good about staying with their party, and to use the words Mitch McConnell used, or to paraphrase him, our goal is to get a Republican president. Like, we don't care about actually governing or passing legislation. That was kind of the attitude when Barack Obama was president. That's tended to be the attitude more generally. But there are going to be, whenever you expand out your coalition, whenever you get more seats, you're going to be, by definition, gain more seats in races that are more competitive. And so there will be some incentive for these representatives from more purple areas to potentially defect on some issues in order to establish their bona fides. So I think your perception is right. I think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible to see, 5 or 10 Republicans decide that they can get more power by, being more moderate.
Okay, your comment about Mitch McConnell and this idea that the Republicans aren't interested in governing; they're interested in getting in a Republican president so that they can start to implement or continue to implement the agenda that Donald Trump had from after 2016. I'm shocked that there's not a bigger pushback against that, because the whole idea that you're electing a representative who just doesn't care about governing. They have a culture war agenda, a religious agenda, an alt-right political agenda, and that's more important than making sure that, bridges are repaired and roads are built and, planes don't fall out of the sky. I just can't. Why is that? Why is there not a bigger pushback?
Oh, there's a whole political science literature dealing with this whole issue of polarization. But to put it simply, is that it seems like over the last 20 or so years, voters have been moving into more homogenous districts where people tend to be very tightly polarized, very much us versus them. The center has shrunk. You see, the two parties in Congress, as well as, their supporters, just moving apart to the point where, I mean, for example, there was an experiment that suggested people were more likely to deny a scholarship to someone on the basis of their partisanship than on the basis of things like racial cues and things like that. And so, it seems at least like it's just become so hyper polarized that, to quote one, this is something that one representative told, he said that he got a group of bipartisan members together and said, "Hey, I want to work with you all." And one of his colleagues from the other side said, "No, you don't understand. I was sent here to make sure you don't get what you want. That's my job, is to block anything that you would do." Now, he said later on they actually did end up working together on something, but it's basically shot through American politics right now that people don't want the other side to succeed. Success is winning, which is problematic in my mind, but I'm not
Boy,
elected.
yeah, that's a sea change in political culture, and we're starting to see some of that filter its way into Canada, unfortunately. But let's talk about oil and gas, because you're
Yep.
based in Houston, and of course Texas is the home of American oil and gas, Permian Basin, all of that. And the oil industry has already locked horns with President Biden over leases on federal lands, for example, leases in the Gulf of Mexico. Does the additional Republican representatives change that dynamic, change the calculation out of the White House, or status quo?
Well, so both sides would really like to see some changes, for example, in permitting processes for the building of like new energy plants and things like that. Both of them have very different proposals for doing so. Assuming that there's nothing done during the lame duck session to try to get something through before Republicans take control of the House, I think you will see an effort towards a bipartisan push towards some kind of permitting reform. Now, what that will look like is kind of unclear. The Republican proposal for example, not letting states enforce clean air and water provisions in permitting new power plants, and not including issues like the implications of new CO2 emissions. Those are probably a non-starter for the Biden administration. Even if Republicans get both houses of Congress, that's one where I could see Biden vetoing it, and they don't have the power to override it. But there is some room, to loosen the restrictions on new drilling. Certainly, there are going to be some Democrats who will be interested in supporting that, given the state of gas prices right now. There's discussion about bipartisan support for the NOPEC bill. I'm not sure if you've been following this. The bill that would allow the United States to sue OPEC countries, which has all kinds of implications. We could talk for a full time just about NOPEC and everything that's going on there. So there is room for them to work together, but nobody's going to get 100% of what they want based on these election results. There'll have to be some people who are willing to cross the line and give a little bit on each side.
Okay, based on the results, it's very likely that we might see Biden and the Democrats having a little more trouble getting some of their projects may fall off the table. Who knows? But nothing radical. Nothing. The basic agenda can go forward for the next 2 years. Look, Ryan.
Oh, sorry. No, I think you will. So you'll see it push the agenda, and I think also what you'll see is a lot of states continuing to push more of a clean energy, and even localities. Surprisingly, the Harris County judge ended up staying with the Democrats, and so you'll probably even on the local level too see this kind of push towards more clean energy.
Well, we'll watch with bated breath because we know that Donald Trump has already hinted that there's an announcement coming on the 15th, and everybody is pretty much guessing that he's going to run again in 2024. So it'll be nothing but if not entertaining. So thank you very much, Ryan. Really appreciate this.
Thank you so much.